Here's the thing about being a kid in Tudor times that'll blow your mind. Roughly 1 in 4 children never saw their 5th birthday. About half wouldn't make it past age 10. Let that sink in. In your average Tudor classroom, half those kids wouldn't survive to adulthood. Parents had lots of children, knowing full well that many wouldn't survive. This wasn't some distant tragedy. It was everyday life. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, let's head back to Tudor England, 1526. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So congratulations, you just woke up as 7-year-old Edward Radcliffe, son of Sir Thomas Radcliffe, a minor noble in the court of King Henry VIII. It's not your modern bedroom with soft sheets and a memory foam mattress. Nope. You're waking up on a straw-filled mattress in the upper chamber of your family's manor house in Hampshire. A sliver of grey dawn light sneaks through the wooden shutters covering the small window. The room is chilly, damn cold actually. There's no central heating here, just the dying embers of last night's fire in the small fireplace across the room. The heavy wool blankets covering you are scratchy against your skin, and the linen sheets beneath you aren't much better. Your nose twitches at the familiar smells of your bedchamber, the sweet sour scent of the rushes on the floor mingled with dried herbs like lavender and rosemary that were scattered among them to mask less pleasant odours. There's the faint smell of smoke from the fire and the earthy aroma of the wooden beams above your head. You're not alone in this room. Your 2 younger brothers, George and Henry, aged 5 and 3, are still sleeping in their trundle bed nearby. As the eldest son, you get to sleep in a proper bed rather than on a simple pallet on the floor. The sound of movement downstairs tells you the household is already stirring. Servants are up before dawn, preparing for the day. Your father, being a nobleman, will have business to attend to. Your mother will oversee the household affairs. "Oh, Master Edward," comes a voice as the door creaks open. It's Alice, your family's most trusted servant, carrying a small tallow candle that casts flickering shadows on the walls. "Time to rise, young master. Your tutor will be waiting." Not like today when kids can sleep in on weekends or school holidays. Tudor children, especially from noble families, kept strict schedules. Your day is about to begin, and it will be packed with activities meant to prepare you for adulthood. With a yawn, you push back the covers. The chill of the morning air hits you immediately, making your skin prickle. No lazy morning stretches here. You need to get moving to stay warm. Unlike your comfy bed at home right now, Tudor beds were lumpy affairs that often housed bedbugs and fleas. Even in wealthy households, these uninvited bedfellows were common companions. "Your prayers, Master Edward," Alice reminds you gently. "Oh right, before anything else, before even getting dressed, you must kneel beside your bed and recite your morning prayers. Religion isn't just part of Tudor life, it's woven into every moment of every day. Even as a child, you're expected to know your prayers and say them faithfully each morning and night. You kneel on the cold wooden floor, the chill seeping through the thin linen of your night shift, and begin to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin. Pater Noster, quies in caelis. This is 1526, remember. Henry VIII hasn't broken with Rome yet. England is still a Catholic country. Every child, whether noble or common, learns these prayers by heart from the earliest age. Forgetting them or refusing to say them isn't an option. Prayer finished, it's time to get dressed. And damn, this is nothing like pulling on your comfy jeans and t-shirt. First, Alice helps you into a clean linen shirt that reaches to your knees. This is your underwear, essentially, but you'll wear it day and night, changing it maybe once a week if you're lucky. On top of that goes your doublet, a close-fitting jacket made of wool with buttons down the front and a small collar. The wool is scratchy against your neck, but it's warm. Next come the hose, not tights exactly, but separate legs that tie to your doublet with laces called points. Getting these on without them twisting or bunching is an art form. The hose are made of wool too, dyed a deep russet colour that marks your status as the son of a gentleman. "Stand still, Master Edward," Alice chides as she works to lace everything properly. "Your father would be displeased to see you slovenly dressed." Appearances matter tremendously in Tudor England. Even for a child, clothing signals your place in the rigid social hierarchy. Your outfit is modest compared to what the children of higher-ranking nobles might wear, but it's still a far cry from a peasant boy's simple garments. Once you're dressed, Alice brings a basin of water for washing. It's cold. Heating water is a luxury, even in a noble household like yours. You splash your face and hands quickly, teeth chattering. No full-body showers here. Tudors weren't actually as dirty as people think. But daily bathing as we know it wasn't a thing. You might get a proper bath once every few weeks. Alice hands you a small bone comb to tidy your hair. It's kept short, just below your ears, in the fashion appropriate for a boy your age. Girls, meanwhile, would have their hair bound up under caps or coifs once they reached about 6 or 7 years old. Your father awaits you in the hall for breaking fast, Alice tells you, as she straightens your collar one last time. Breakfast in Tudor England isn't the most important meal of the day. In fact, many adults skip it entirely, but children are usually given something to eat in the morning, especially in wealthy households where food is plentiful. You make your way down the narrow wooden staircase, your leather shoes making soft tapping sounds on the steps. The great hall of your family's manor is already busy with activity. Servants move about, setting up trestle tables for the day's meals. Your father sits at the high table, reviewing some papers, likely accounts or correspondence. "Good morning, father," you say, with a small bow. Children in Tudor times showed extreme deference to their parents. You wouldn't speak unless spoken to first, and physical affection like hugs or kisses wasn't common between parents and children in noble households. "Edward," your father acknowledges with a nod. "I trust you are ready for your lessons." "Yes, father." Your breakfast is brought to you, a small manchet loaf, the finest white bread reserved for the upper classes, with a bit of butter and a wooden cup of watered-down ale. Yes, ale. Even children drink alcohol in Tudor England since water often isn't safe. Don't worry, it's very weak, but still odd to think about 7-year-olds drinking ale with breakfast. As you eat, you notice your mother entering the hall with your younger sister, Elizabeth, who's 9. Girls in noble families aren't educated the same way as boys. While you're preparing for a future that might include university, government service, or managing the family estates, Elizabeth is being groomed for marriage and running a household. "Good morning, Mother," you and Elizabeth say almost in unison, both giving small bows. Your mother, dressed in a fine wool gown with a white linen partlet covering her neck and chest, nods in acknowledgement. "Edward, Master Smithson is waiting in the library. Elizabeth, you will join me today for instruction in needlework and household accounts." Master Smithson is your tutor, hired by your father to provide you with the education befitting a gentleman's son. At 7, you're considered ready for more formal studies. Before this, you learned basic reading and numbers, along with proper behaviour and religious instruction from your mother and the household chaplain. You finish your bread quickly and make your way to the small library, really just a room with a desk, some chairs, and a modest collection of books. Books are expensive, handmade items in Tudor England. Your family's dozen or so volumes represent significant wealth. Master Smithson, a thin man with a serious expression, is already waiting. He studied at Oxford and now earns his living teaching the children of the gentry. "You're late, Master Edward," he says sternly, though you're not really. Punctuality is strictly enforced for Tudor children. We begin with Latin. Latin is the foundation of a proper Tudor education. It's the language of the church, law, medicine, and international diplomacy. You'll spend hours conjugating verbs and memorizing grammar rules. Amo, amus, amat, you recite, the familiar pattern of the Latin verb to love. Master Smithson nods, unsmiling. Continue. Amamus, amatis, amant. You finish. The morning stretches before you. 3 or 4 hours of Latin, followed by lessons in mathematics, writing practice, and religious studies. You learn not just from books, but from copying texts onto a slate board with chalk, or sometimes onto parchment with a quill pen if you're practicing your best penmanship. There are no weekends off. Tudor children in school study 6 days a week, with only Sunday set aside for church and limited recreation. The school day typically runs from dawn until dusk, with a brief break for the midday meal. And discipline, it's harsh by modern standards. That birch rod leaning in the corner of the room isn't for show. Corporal punishment is common and expected. A mistake in your Latin conjugations, sloppy handwriting, or a moment of daydreaming might earn you a sharp rap across the knuckles or worse. "Focus, Edward," Master Smithson says sharply, noticing your attention wandering to the window where you can see other children, servants' children, carrying water from the well. "A gentleman must have mastery of his mind." You straighten immediately. "Yes, Master Smithson." It might seem harsh, but in Tudor England, childhood isn't viewed as a special protected time of innocence and play. Rather, it's seen as preparation for adult responsibilities. By age 7, you're already on the path to adulthood, learning the skills and knowledge you'll need for your future role. For noble boys like you, that future likely includes managing estates, perhaps serving at court or in government, and upholding your family's position in society. Your education reflects these goals. You'll learn not just academic subjects, but also riding, hunting, dancing, and proper manners, all essential skills for a Tudor gentleman. Girls from noble families have a different educational path. Your sister Elizabeth's day includes some reading and writing, perhaps a bit of French, music lessons on the lute or virginals, an early keyboard instrument, and extensive training in needlework, household management, and the medicinal uses of herbs and plants. She's being prepared for her future role as a wife and mother, managing a household and raising children. By mid-morning, your stomach is starting to rumble again. The small breakfast has worn off, and lunchtime, or dinner as the main meal is called in Tudor England, is still hours away, typically served around 11 o'clock. "Let us turn to arithmetic," Master Smithson announces, putting aside the Latin texts. "A merchant has 3 barrels of wine. The first is 3/4 full, the second is half full, and the third is 1/4 full. If each barrel holds 20 gallons when full, how many gallons of wine does the merchant have in total?" You concentrate, working through the problem in your head. Math in Tudor times is practical, focused on the kinds of calculations necessary for trade, managing estates, and handling money. 30 gallons, Master Smithson, you answer after a moment. He nods, showing rare approval. Correct. Through the window you can hear the sounds of the manor farm, chickens clucking, a cow lowing, the distant shouts of the farm labourers. Somewhere a dog barks. The smell of bread baking in the kitchen wafts in, making your stomach growl louder. Tudor life is full of sensory experiences, not all of them pleasant. The smells can be overwhelming in a world without modern sanitation. Even in wealthy homes like yours, the combined odors of people, animals, cooking, and waste create a pungent atmosphere that modern noses would find hard to bear. Now, your writing practice, Master Smithson says, placing a sheet of paper before you. Paper is expensive, so you must be careful not to waste it. Copy this passage from Cicero, paying attention to your letter forms. You dip the quill in the inkwell and begin to write carefully. A blot or smudge will earn you a rap across the knuckles. The quill scratches against the paper as you form each letter with concentration. Outside, the morning is advancing. Sunlight now streams through the window, falling across your desk. In the courtyard, you can hear your younger brothers being allowed some playtime before their simpler lessons begin. At 5 and 3, they're still considered too young for rigorous education, though they're already learning basic prayers, manners, and letters. Your mother passes by the open door, pausing briefly to glance in. She's on her way to the kitchen to oversee preparations for the midday meal. Running a Tudor household is a complex job requiring knowledge of food storage, preservation, cooking, medicine, textile production, and management of servants. Your sister follows behind her, learning by observation and practice. The morning continues with your studies, the room growing warmer as the sun rises higher. Unlike children today, you don't fidget or complain about being inside on a nice day. Tudor children, especially from noble families, are taught strict self-control from an early age. We will conclude the morning with religion, Master Smithson says eventually, closing the arithmetic book. He opens a Latin prayer book, pointing to a passage. Read, and then we shall discuss the meaning. Religion isn't just a subject to study, it's the framework for understanding the entire world in Tudor England. Every natural phenomenon, from thunder to illness to a good harvest, is seen as an expression of God's will. Children absorb this worldview from infancy. As you read the Latin passage aloud, carefully pronouncing each word, you're aware that mistakes in religious instruction are taken especially seriously. Blasphemy or heresy, even from a child, could have serious consequences. The Tudor period is a time of religious flux and tension, as new ideas from the Reformation begin to challenge traditional Catholic teachings. Though you're only 7, you've already learned to be cautious about religious matters, to say the right prayers and make the proper observances. Your family's position and prosperity depend in part on being on the right side of both earthly and divine authority. The passage is from the Gospel of Matthew about honouring one's father and mother. Master Smithson asks you to explain its meaning. It teaches us to obey our parents in all things, you answer carefully, as God has placed them in authority over us. Good, he nods. And what does the commandment promise to those who honour their parents? That their days may be long in the land, you recite from memory. Remember this well, Master Smithson says, more gently than usual. Obedience to proper authority, to parents, to the king, to the church, this is the foundation of a godly and orderly life. For Tudor children, obedience isn't just good behaviour, it's a moral and religious obligation. Respect for hierarchy and authority is instilled from the earliest age. Children who question or disobey face not just punishment, but the suggestion that they're sinning against the divine order. The sound of a bell rings through the manor house. It's nearly time for dinner, the main meal of the day, served at around 11 o'clock. Your morning lessons are done, but the day is far from over. After eating, you'll have more lessons, perhaps some supervised physical activity, like archery practice, and then evening prayers before bed. You may go, Master Smithson says, gathering his books. We will continue with Latin composition after dinner. You stand, bow respectfully, and leave the library. Your legs are stiff from sitting still all morning, but you don't run or skip through the house. That would be considered undignified behavior for a noble child. Instead, you walk properly, back straight, at a measured pace, toward the hall where the household will gather for the meal. In the great hall, servants are setting the long trestle tables. Your father sits at the high table with a visitor, a neighbouring landowner discussing some business matter. Your mother directs the servants with quiet efficiency, making sure everything is properly arranged according to the strict protocols of Tudor dining. Your place is at the high table, but below the salt, a large salt cellar that divides the table and marks social distinctions. Those seated above the salt are of higher status. Those below, including children, even the children of the house, are of lower status. Even at the dinner table, Tudor social hierarchy is clearly displayed. The food arrives, far more plentiful than what most people in Tudor England eat, but still limited by season and preservation methods. There's a vegetable pottage, a thick soup, freshly baked bread, some cold sliced beef from yesterday's roast, a small pie filled with pigeons and apples from the manor's orchard. You take your place, waiting for your father to be served first, then your mother, then the guest, before you or your siblings may begin eating. Table manners are strict. No reaching, no talking with food in your mouth, using your knife properly and keeping your place tidy. The meal passes with little conversation from the children. Tudor children, especially at the table, are expected to be seen and not heard unless specifically addressed by an adult. Your younger brothers, seated further down the table with their nursemaid, are still learning this discipline. 3-year-old Henry occasionally forgets and chatters, earning himself a stern look from your father. As you eat, you listen to the adults' conversation. Your father and his guest discuss the king's latest proclamation, the price of wool, and news from London. Tudor children, particularly boys destined for positions of responsibility, are encouraged to learn about adult concerns from an early age. There's no concept of shielding children from adult topics like politics or business. After dinner, there's a brief period of rest. The adults might have some wine and continue their discussions, while children have a little more freedom, but it doesn't last long. Soon enough, it's time to return to your lessons. The afternoon stretches ahead, filled with more Latin, some history, and perhaps some instruction in music or drawing if there's time. Tudor education for noble children is comprehensive, designed to produce well-rounded individuals prepared for their place in society. And this is just one morning in the life of a Tudor child from the nobility. Across England, countless other children are experiencing very different mornings in craftsmen's workshops, on farms, in village schools, or in royal palaces. Their days are shaped by their social class, gender, location, and the specific moment in the tumultuous Tudor period. Tomorrow, we'll see what life is like for a different Tudor child, perhaps a farmer's daughter or a city apprentice. The contrast will be stark because in Tudor England, where you're born determines almost everything about your childhood experience, what you eat, how you dress, what you learn, and what future awaits you. But for now, young Edward returns to his books, the spring sunlight slanting through the library window, illuminating motes of dust that dance in the air as he bends over his Latin exercises, quill scratching on parchment, another hour of childhood ticking by in the great manor house in Hampshire. While young Edward Radcliffe was studying Latin with his tutor across the Hampshire countryside, another child was already hours into her day. Agnes Fletcher, 9 years old, had been awake since before dawn. No one had to wake her. The roosters did that job just fine. Agnes wasn't the daughter of a nobleman. Her father, John Fletcher, was a yeoman farmer, not the poorest sort, but certainly no gentleman. They had a small cottage with a thatched roof, 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, and enough land to grow crops and keep some animals. The morning chill bit at Agnes's toes as she climbed down from the sleeping loft. Unlike Edward with his private bedchamber, Agnes shared the loft with her 4 siblings. Her older brother Will, who was 12, her younger sisters Mary and Joan, who were 6 and 4, and baby Thomas, who was barely 1 year old. They all slept on straw-filled mattresses laid directly on the wooden floor, covered with whatever blankets they had. In winter, they'd sleep huddled together for warmth. The cottage was dark, lit only by the glow of embers in the central hearth. Agnes's first job of the day, one she'd been doing since she was 7, was to coax those embers back to life. No fancy fireplace with a chimney like in Edward's manor house. Here the fire burned in the middle of the main room, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the thatch above. "Come on now," she whispered to the glowing coals, carefully adding small pieces of kindling, dried twigs and straw she'd collected yesterday. She blew gently, her chapped lips stinging in the cold air. A small flame flickered to life. Success. Agnes added slightly larger sticks, nurturing the fire until it crackled properly. Her mother was already up, nursing baby Thomas. "Good girl," she said quietly, nodding at the growing fire. "Now fetch some water." Agnes grabbed the wooden bucket by the door. Outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painted in shades of grey and pale blue. Dew soaked the grass and mud squished beneath her bare feet as she made her way to the small stream that ran near their cottage. No servants to carry water for this family. Every drop used for cooking, cleaning, or washing had to be fetched by someone in the household. The water was so cold it made her hands ache as she filled the bucket. It was heavy too, sloshing as she lugged it back to the cottage. Some splashed on her simple linen smock, her only piece of clothing besides a woolen kirtle dress she'd put on later. By the time Agnes returned with the water, her father and older brother were up and preparing to head to the fields. Spring planting wouldn't wait, and the day's work needed to start early. "Porridge ready soon?" her father asked her mother, pulling on his worn leather boots. "As soon as Agnes gets the pot heating," her mother replied, adjusting baby Thomas at her breast. That was Agnes's cue. She hung the iron cooking pot on its hook over the fire and poured in some of the water she'd fetched. From a wooden barrel in the corner, she scooped out a measure of oats. No fine white manchet bread for breakfast here, like Edward might have. The Fletcher family's daily bread was dark and coarse, made from whatever grain they could grow or afford. The porridge would be plain, maybe flavoured with a little salt if they were lucky, or occasionally honey from their beehives. On special days there might be a bit of cheese or an egg to go with it, but not usually. Most mornings it was just porridge, day after day. As the oats began to simmer in the pot, Agnes's younger sisters woke up, climbing down from the loft with sleep-tousled hair and rubbing their eyes. "Go help your father and Will with the animals before breakfast," her mother told them. Even at 6 and 4, Mary and Joan had chores to do, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, carrying small tools. Tudor children entered the world of work early, regardless of their social standing. Agnes stirred the thickening porridge with a wooden spoon. The cottage was filling with the comforting smell of cooking oats and wood smoke. Her stomach growled. Unlike the gentry who might eat lightly in the morning and have their main meal at midday, farming families needed substantial food to start their day of physical labour. "Tell your father and brother the porridge is ready," her mother said, placing baby Thomas in a simple wooden cradle near the fire. Agnes stepped outside again. The sun was just peeking over the horizon now, casting long shadows across the muddy yard where chickens pecked for insects and their old dog, Patch, lay watching the activity with half-closed eyes. "Father, Will, breakfast!" she called toward the small barn where they were milking their 2 cows. Breakfast was a quick, simple affair. The family gathered around the trestle table, each with a wooden bowl of steaming porridge. They ate quickly with wooden spoons. No fancy table manners required here, though Agnes's mother did insist they say a prayer before eating. "Agnes, once you've finished, I need you to help me with the cheese making," her mother said between bites. "The milk from yesterday needs turning." Making cheese was one of many household skills Agnes was learning. By her age, she was already quite competent at a range of domestic tasks that would prepare her for her likely future as a farmer's wife. While Edward learned Latin and mathematics, Agnes learned how to preserve food, spin wool, make cheese, brew ale, and tend to younger children. After breakfast, her father and Will headed to the fields with their ox and plough. The younger girls were set to simple tasks, gathering eggs, sweeping the packed earth floor of the cottage, picking herbs from the small garden plot. Agnes helped her mother clear away the breakfast things, scraping the bowls clean and rinsing them with a little precious water. Nothing was wasted in a Tudor household, especially not among the common folk. "Now for the cheese," her mother said, pulling out a large earthenware crock containing yesterday's milk, which had been sitting overnight. Cheese-making was a precise art that Agnes had been learning since she was about 6. First, they skimmed off the cream from the top of the milk. That would be used to make butter later. Then they gently warmed the skimmed milk near the fire. "Not too hot," her mother cautioned. "Just warm enough to take the chill off." The next step was adding rennet, an enzyme from a calf's stomach that would cause the milk to curdle. Agnes's family, like most Tudor farmers, slaughtered their own animals and saved every usable part. Nothing was wasted. While they waited for the milk to curdle, Agnes's mother set her to spinning. A basket of cleaned and carded wool sat beside a simple drop spindle. "Your thread was too uneven yesterday," her mother said. "Practice more today." Agnes nodded and began the familiar task of drawing out the wool fibres and twisting them into thread. Unlike rich girls who might learn decorative embroidery, Agnes was learning practical textile skills, spinning thread that would later be woven into cloth for the family's clothes and household linens. Her fingers worked the wool while her mind wandered. Sometimes, on market days, she'd seen the fine ladies from the big houses in their colourful gowns with embroidery and lace. Agnes's own clothing was plain, functional, and often patched. Her kirtle, the main outer garment worn by women and girls, was made of coarse wool dyed a dull brown with walnut shells. She owned exactly 2 sets of clothes, one to wear while the other was being washed, which didn't happen very often. By mid-morning, the milk had separated into curds and whey. Agnes helped her mother carefully ladle the curds into a cheesecloth-lined wooden mould. The whey drained off and was collected in a bucket. It wouldn't be wasted, but used to feed the pigs or even drunk by the family. "Press it firmly," her mother instructed, showing Agnes how to squeeze out the excess moisture. "But not so hard you push out all the cream." This cheese would be a simple farmer's cheese, eaten fresh within a few days. For special occasions or to preserve milk longer, they made harder cheeses that could age for months. While they worked, her mother sang a simple folk tune, and Agnes joined in. This was how knowledge was passed down, not through books or formal lessons, but through doing, watching, and remembering. Agnes was learning by being her mother's shadow, absorbing the hundreds hundreds of skills needed to run a Tudor household. By the time the cheese was pressed and set aside to drain further, it was nearly time to begin preparing the midday meal. Agnes's father and brother would come in from the fields, hungry after a morning of hard physical labour. "Go to the garden and pull some leeks and carrots," her mother told her, "and check if any of the early cabbages are ready." The family's garden plot was small but vital, providing most of the vegetables they ate. Unlike the gentry who could afford imported spices and luxuries, common folk ate what they could grow or raise themselves, supplemented by what little they could afford to buy or trade for. Agnes pulled several leeks from the soft soil and brushed off the dirt. She found a few winter carrots still good for eating and checked the cabbages, but they weren't quite ready yet. On her way back to the cottage, she plucked some fresh herbs, thyme and sage, that grew wild along the path. Inside, her mother had a pot of pottage, a thick soup or stew that was a staple of the Tudor diet, already starting over the fire. Into it would go whatever vegetables were available, perhaps some barley or dried peas, and if they were lucky, a small piece of salt pork for flavour. Agnes chopped the vegetables on a wooden board with a small knife, her movements confident despite her young age. By 9, she was trusted with tasks that modern parents might consider dangerous for children, but in Tudor England, children were integrated into household work early, handling knives, fire, and animals as a matter of course. "We need more water for the pottage," her mother said, glancing at the nearly empty bucket. Agnes sighed but picked up the bucket without complaint. Multiple trips to the stream were a daily reality. As she stepped outside, she saw Mary and Joan playing a simple game with pebbles in the dirt yard, giggling as they tossed and caught the small stones. "Mother says to feed the chickens when you're done playing," Agnes told them, feeling very grown-up and responsible compared to her younger sisters. The gulf between 9 and 6 seemed enormous in terms of expectations and responsibilities. Water fetched and vegetables added to the pot, Agnes's next job was to knead the bread dough that had been rising since early morning. Bread was baked only once or twice a week in most farmhouses to save on precious firewood. The dough was prepared in a large wooden trough and left to rise slowly. Agnes pushed her sleeves up and plunged her hands into the dough, feeling it squish between her fingers. She pushed and folded, working the air out of the sticky mass. It was hard work for young arms, but she was used to it. "Good," her mother nodded, checking her progress. "Now shape the loaves." Agnes divided the dough and formed several round loaves, placing them on a floured board to rise again before baking. As midday approached, Agnes's father and brother returned from the fields for their main meal. Their faces were ruddy from work and weather, hands calloused and dirt-ingrained. Will, at 12, already worked alongside his father doing a man's labour. Just as Agnes was learning to be a housewife, Will was learning to be a farmer by doing the work day in and day out. The family gathered again around the table for their main meal, pottage ladled into wooden bowls, bread torn from yesterday's loaf, and a small piece of cheese for each person. They washed it down with weak ale, the everyday drink even for children, as water was often unsafe. The ale was brewed by Agnes's mother, another household skill that Agnes would soon learn. "The north field needs clearing of stones before we can finish ploughing," her father said between bites. "Will and I will do that this afternoon. Agnes, your mother needs help with the washing." Agnes nodded. Laundry was one of the most back-breaking household tasks, done only every few weeks or even months in many homes. It involved hauling endless buckets of water, scrubbing clothes with homemade lye soap on a washboard, boiling linens in a large copper kettle over an outdoor fire, then rinsing and wringing them out before hanging them to dry. The afternoon would be spent in this labour, her hands raw and chapped from the harsh soap and cold water, but Agnes wouldn't complain. This was simply what life was. After the midday meal, her father and brother returned to the fields. Agnes and her mother cleared away the dishes. Then began the massive undertaking of wash day. "We'll start with the linens," her mother decided, gathering up the family's few sheets and shirts. They worked outside, setting up a large wooden tub. Agnes made countless trips to the stream for water while her mother built a fire to heat some of it. The soiled linens were first soaked in cold water, then scrubbed with rough soap made from animal fat and wood ash. Agnes's fingers ached from the scrubbing and the cold water, but she kept at it. Next came the most difficult part. The linens were placed in the copper kettle with more soap and boiled over the fire, stirred occasionally with a long wooden stick. "Mind you don't splash yourself," her mother warned as Agnes helped stir the steaming pot. Burns were a common household injury, especially on wash days. After boiling, the linens had to be rinsed in clean water, wrung out by hand and hung on bushes or a rope line to dry in the spring breeze. By the time they finished, Agnes's arms felt like lead and her back ached from bending over the wash tubs. Yet the day's work wasn't done. There were still the evening chores, bringing in more firewood, tending the animals, preparing the evening meal. In a farmer's household, work was constant from dawn until dusk. While Agnes worked alongside her mother, her education continued, not from books or formal lessons, but through oral tradition and hands-on experience. She learned which plants could be used for dyeing cloth, which herbs might ease a toothache or settle a stomach, how to tell when bread was baked just right, and how to predict weather changes by watching the sky and animals. "See how the swallows are flying low?" her mother pointed out as they hung the laundry. "We'll have rain by tomorrow." This practical knowledge was far more valuable to Agnes's future than Latin or arithmetic would have been. As a farmer's wife, she would need to run a household, raise children, preserve food, make medicine, and help with farm work. Unlike Edward, whose education prepared him for a life of relative privilege, Agnes's education prepared her for survival in a world where life was fragile and hardship common. By the time she reached adulthood, if she survived childhood, which was far from certain, she would need to be strong, skilled, and resourceful. As the afternoon waned, Agnes's younger sisters were set to picking stones from the dried peas that would go into tomorrow's pottage. Even at 4 and 6, they had useful tasks to perform. Tudor childhoods were short, with adult responsibilities beginning early. Agnes herself took charge of baby Thomas while her mother prepared the evening meal. Another pot of pottage, though thinner than the midday version, perhaps with a bit of bacon added if they were fortunate. She bounced the baby on her hip, a skill she'd been practicing since she was barely more than a toddler herself. Looking after younger siblings was one of the first responsibilities given to Tudor girls. "He's cutting a tooth," Agnes told her mother, noticing Thomas's red cheeks and drool. Her mother nodded, reaching into a small pouch hung by the hearth. "Rub a bit of this on his gums," she said, handing Agnes a tiny amount of honey mixed with crushed herbs. "It will ease the pain." Agnes dabbed the mixture on her brother's swollen gums, soothing him as he fussed. These remedies, passed down through generations of women, were the only healthcare most Tudor families had access to. There were no doctors for common folk, only the knowledge of herbs and treatments preserved in oral tradition. As the shadows lengthened across the yard, Agnes's father and brother returned from the fields, tired and hungry. The family gathered once more around the table for their evening meal. Compared to the elaborate dinners served in Edward's manor house, with multiple courses and servants to wait on the family, the Fletchers' supper was simple fare: pottage, bread, perhaps some cheese, and ale. After supper, there was still work to be done. Candles or rushlights were too expensive to use regularly, so the family made the most of the fading daylight. Agnes helped her mother mend torn clothing by the light from the hearth fire. Her father and brother repaired tools or worked on crafting new ones. The younger children were set to carding wool, teasing it out with simple wooden combs to prepare it for spinning. As darkness fell completely, the family gathered around the fire for evening prayers. Though they couldn't read the Bible for themselves, none of them could read at all. They knew the Lord's Prayer and other common devotions by heart. Religion structured their days, just as it did for wealthy families, though with less ceremony. Finally, it was time for sleep. The fire was banked to keep embers alive until morning. Agnes and her siblings climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft, settling onto their straw mattresses fully clothed. They slept in the same garments they wore during the day. Their parents would sleep in the only bed downstairs near the fire, with baby Thomas in a cradle nearby. Agnes lay in the darkness, listening to her siblings' breathing and the occasional rustle of mice in the thatch above. Through gaps in the roof, she could see stars sprinkled across the night sky. Her body ached from the day's labor, but this was normal. She knew no other way of life. While Edward would grow up to manage estates or serve at court, Agnes's future was narrower, but no less important. By 15 or 16, she would likely marry a farmer or craftsman from a nearby village, bringing her household skills to a new home, bearing children and continuing the cycle of Tudor rural life. Her education wouldn't lead to books or scholarship, but it prepared her for survival in a harsh world. She could preserve food to last through winter, brew ale that wouldn't make her family sick, deliver a baby if needed, treat common ailments with herbs, spin thread and weave cloth, manage livestock, and 100 other practical skills that kept Tudor society functioning. As Agnes drifted towards sleep, her mind wasn't on Latin verbs or court etiquette, but on tomorrow's tasks, churning butter from the cream they'd skimmed, helping with more planting, perhaps gathering early spring greens from the woods to supplement their meals. Her childhood was passing quickly, heavy with responsibilities, but rich with practical knowledge that would serve her throughout her life. Both Agnes and Edward, though living just miles apart, inhabited different worlds within the same Tudor England. Their childhoods were shaped by birth and circumstance, preparing them for vastly different adult lives in a society where social mobility was rare and life paths were largely determined before birth. In the darkness of the sleeping loft, Agnes finally closed her eyes. Another day of her Tudor childhood complete, her calloused hands tucked under her cheek as she surrendered to exhaustion and sleep. The spring sun had barely cleared the rooftops of London when Thomas Baker was jolted awake by a sharp kick to his ribs. "Up, boy, the master wants the fire lit before he comes down." Thomas blinked sleep from his eyes and rolled quickly off his thin pallet on the workshop floor. His fellow apprentice, Peter, was already pulling on his clothes. At 13, Thomas was 4 years into his 7-year apprenticeship with Master William Cooper, one of London's respected coopers, craftsmen who made barrels, casks, buckets and tubs. Unlike Edward with his manor house education or Agnes on her family farm, Thomas lived in the crowded heart of London, learning a trade that would eventually make him a freeman of the city. "Coming," Thomas mumbled, fumbling for his clothes in the dim light. He slept in just a linen shirt and now pulled on his leather jerkin and woolen hose, both worn thin at the elbows and knees. His feet were tucked into wooden clogs that clattered on the wooden floor. The Cooper's house stood on a narrow street in the parish of St Olave Hart Street near the Tower of London. Like most London houses, it was tall and narrow, built of timber with the upper floors jutting out over the street. The ground floor held the workshop with its tools and supplies, while the family lived above and the apprentices slept wherever space could be found, usually the workshop floor. Thomas and Peter were just two of Master Cooper's 4 apprentices. The other two, Henry and Martin, were older and in their 6th year of training. They slept in the attic room and, being senior apprentices, enjoyed slightly better accommodations and fewer menial tasks. The workshop was cold after the night, the fire having died to ash hours ago. Thomas knelt at the hearth, arranging kindling and blowing carefully to bring the flames to life. The smell of wood shavings and fresh timber permeated everything. After 4 years, Thomas's clothes, his hair, even his skin seemed permanently infused with the scent of oak and pine. "Hurry up with that fire, then fetch water," Peter hissed, already sweeping wood chips from yesterday's work into a pile. At 11, Peter was the newest apprentice, having joined the household just 6 months ago. He was still adjusting to the strict routine and long hours. Thomas worked quickly. The life of an apprentice was governed by rigid schedules and endless tasks. Their days started well before Master Cooper and his family rose, and often ended long after they retired. In between, there were barrels to make, deliveries to complete, tools to maintain, and countless household chores. Fire lit and blazing, Thomas grabbed 2 wooden buckets and headed for the door. "Don't dawdle this time," Peter called after him. "The mistress said she'd box your ears if you're late again." Thomas grimaced. Mistress Cooper, the master's wife, ran the household with iron efficiency. She was fair but strict, and not one to make idle threats. Her box on the ears 2 days ago, when Thomas had lingered too long watching a street performer, still stung his pride more than his ear. Outside, London was coming to life. The narrow streets were already filling with people, servants heading to the market, merchants opening shops, labourers looking for day work. The smells hit Thomas immediately, the sour odour of night soil being carted away, wood smoke from countless chimneys, the yeasty scent of a nearby bakery, and under it all, the constant dank smell of the Thames. Thomas made his way to the public conduit at the end of the street where water flowed through lead pipes from springs outside the city. Already a line was forming, maidservants with buckets, apprentices like himself, and the occasional housewife. Water was London's lifeblood, yet always in short supply. As Thomas waited his turn, he watched the city wake up around him. A group of children from poorer families darted past, probably heading to beg or scavenge near the markets. Unlike Thomas with his secured apprenticeship, many London children faced uncertain futures. Orphans, abandoned children, and those whose parents couldn't afford to place them in apprenticeships often lived by their wits, taking whatever work they could find, holding horses, running errands, or less savoury occupations. "You're Master Cooper's boy, aren't you?" asked the woman ahead of him in line, her own bucket nearly full. "Yes, mistress," Thomas answered politely, straightening his posture. An apprentice's behaviour reflected on his master, and Thomas had been taught to be respectful to all adults, particularly in public. "Tell your master my husband needs 3 small ale casks by Friday. He's the brewer at the White Hart." Thomas nodded. "I'll tell him, mistress." Business often happened this way in Tudor London, through casual conversations and personal connections rather than formal arrangements. As an apprentice, part of Thomas's education was learning these networks of commerce and obligation. With his buckets filled, Thomas hurried back to the Cooper's house, trying not to spill too much as he navigated the increasingly crowded street. A cart loaded with firewood rumbled past, forcing him against a wall. A pig rooted in the gutter, and somewhere a baby wailed. London assaulted all the senses, all the time. Back in the workshop, Master Cooper had appeared, a stocky man with a beard streaked with grey and hands gnarled from decades of shaping wood. "Good. "You're back," he grunted at Thomas. "Give one bucket to the mistress upstairs, then come help with this oak. We've the Vintners Guild order to finish today." Thomas handed one bucket to Peter to carry upstairs, then rolled up his sleeves for the day's real work. This was what he'd come for. Not the fetching and carrying, not the sleeping on a hard floor, but the craft itself. Coopering was a respected trade, and barrels were essential to Tudor commerce. Everything from ale to fish, from gunpowder to apples, was stored and transported in barrels. "We need 6 more hogsheads for the wine merchant," Master Cooper said, indicating the partially completed barrels. A hogshead was a large cask holding 63 gallons, one of many standard sizes that Thomas had learned to make by heart. The master began demonstrating the next step in the process, his movements quick and precise from years of practice. Thomas watched intently. This was how he learned, not from books or formal lessons, but from observation and repetition under his master's watchful eye. "Like this," Master Cooper said, showing how to shape a stave, one of the wooden segments that formed the barrel. "Feel the grain of the wood. Work with it, not against it." Thomas took the draw knife and began to shape his own stave, trying to match his master's technique. His first attempts years ago had been laughable, earning him plenty of cuffs and criticism. Now his hands moved with growing confidence, though still not with the fluid precision of the master or the older apprentices. "Better," Master Cooper nodded, inspecting Thomas's work. "You're finally developing a feel for it." That small praise warmed Thomas more than the workshop fire. Approval from the master was rare and therefore precious. The morning passed in focused work. The 2 senior apprentices, Henry and Martin, worked on assembling barrels, a more advanced skill that involved arranging staves in a frame, then using heat to make the wood pliable enough to bend into the familiar barrel shape. The smell of hot wood and the hiss of steam filled the workshop as they lowered a partially formed barrel over a small fire. Peter, being the newest, was relegated to the simplest tasks, sorting staves by size, sweeping up wood shavings, fetching tools. Thomas occupied the middle ground, trusted with making components but not yet with assembling them. At mid-morning, Mistress Cooper sent down her young maid with tankards of small beer and chunks of brown bread for the workers. Tudor labour was fuelled by beer, the everyday drink for everyone from children to the elderly. This wasn't strong stuff, just enough alcohol to make it safer than water. Thomas gulped his beer gratefully, using a piece of bread to soak up the last drops. Unlike Edward with his Latin texts or Agnes with her household tasks, his education was entirely practical, learning by doing day after day. "Thomas, you'll make the delivery to the Vintners Guild this afternoon," Master Cooper announced, wiping beer foam from his moustache. "Take the handcart. Martin will go with you." Thomas nodded, pleased with the responsibility. Deliveries meant a chance to see more of the city and interact with other craftsmen and merchants. For a boy who had come to London from a small village in Kent, the city remained endlessly fascinating despite its smells and dangers. The work resumed until the church bells rang for noon. In wealthy homes like Edward's, this would signal the main meal of the day, but apprentices ate when the work allowed, often later than their masters. "Finish that batch of staves before you eat," the master instructed, heading upstairs to his own dinner. Thomas worked steadily, the rhythmic scrape of his tools joining the general cacophony of London that filtered through the workshop windows. Street vendors crying their wares, church bells ringing, dogs barking, and the constant murmur of thousands of people going about their business. By the time he finished the staves, his stomach was growling fiercely. Upstairs, he joined the other apprentices at the kitchen table, where Mistress Cooper served them a simple but filling meal, pottage with more vegetables than meat, bread, and more small beer. Unlike Agnes's family meal where everyone ate together, Tudor apprentices typically ate separately from the master's family, though under the same roof. They were neither servants nor family members, but occupied a unique social position, legally bound to their master, who stood in place of their parents during the apprenticeship. "The mistress says you're to mend your jerkin after you eat," the kitchen maid told Thomas. "She saw the tear at the elbow and says it won't do for deliveries." Thomas nodded, his mouth full of bread. Apprentices were expected to maintain a respectable appearance, reflecting on their master's reputation. His parents had provided him with 2 sets of clothing when he began his apprenticeship 4 years ago, but he'd grown since then, and replacements came slowly. Most of his clothes had been taken in and let out multiple times as he shot up in height. After the meal, Thomas found needle and thread to repair his jerkin. Unlike noble boys who would have considered sewing women's work, apprentices had to be self-sufficient. Thomas could sew a serviceable seam, cook a basic meal, and manage other household tasks, in addition to his developing craft skills. The afternoon brought the promised delivery. Thomas and Martin loaded the completed barrels onto a handcart, a simple wooden platform with handles at one end and a wheel at the other. London's streets were too narrow and crowded for horses and carts in many areas, so deliveries were often made this way. "I'll pull, you steer," Martin said, positioning himself between the handles. At 17 and nearly finished with his apprenticeship, he was stocky and strong from years of physical labour. Thomas took his position at the back of the cart, and they set off toward Vintner's Hall near the river. The streets were even busier now than in the morning, a seething mass of humanity going about their business. They passed a group of schoolboys walking in formation behind their master, probably returning to their lessons after their midday meal. Unlike those boys in their grammar school, Thomas's education was all practical, focused on his craft rather than Latin and Greek. They passed shops of all kinds, a butcher with carcasses hanging in the open air, an apothecary with jars of mysterious substances, a mercer selling fine fabrics to wealthy customers. Each shop had its own distinctive sign hanging above the door, necessary in a city where many couldn't read. "Watch out," Martin called as a chamber pot was emptied from an upper window, its contents splattering in the street just ahead of them. This was city life, cramped, smelly, and often hazardous to health. Yet London offered opportunities that a village could not, particularly for an ambitious boy learning a trade. At Vintner's Hall, they were directed to the cellars where their barrels would be filled with wine imported from France and Spain. The Vintners Guild was one of London's 12 great livery companies, powerful organisations that controlled their respective trades. Master Cooper was a freeman of the Coopers' Guild, a status that Thomas himself might attain after completing his apprenticeship and producing a masterpiece, a perfect example of his craft. While Martin discussed the delivery with the cellarman, Thomas gazed around the impressive hall. Guilds were like extended families, providing not just business regulation, but social support, religious observance, and even education for members' children. If Thomas completed his apprenticeship successfully, he would enter this world of guild brotherhood, with all its privileges and responsibilities. "Dreaming again, Thomas?" Martin nudged him. "Come on, we need to get back. Master's got more work waiting." The return journey was easier with an empty cart. As they passed St. Paul's Cathedral, Thomas saw a group of choir boys around his age, dressed in their distinctive robes, heading in for afternoon services. Another type of education altogether. Those boys spent hours each day practicing music and singing, usually while living in a choir school attached to the cathedral. Back at the workshop, the afternoon stretched into evening with more barrel making. As the most experienced apprentice, Martin worked alongside Master Cooper on the most complex tasks. Henry, in his 6th year, worked independently on a smaller barrel. Thomas continued shaping staves and preparing metal hoops, while Peter kept the workshop tidy and the tools in order. "The brewers want another dozen firkins by month's end," Master Cooper announced, examining a piece of parchment that had been delivered during their absence. A firkin was a smaller barrel, holding about 9 gallons, used primarily for ale. "We'll need more oak. Thomas, tomorrow you'll go with me to the timber merchant." Thomas nodded, pleased with the assignment. Each new responsibility was a sign of his progress, a step closer to mastering his craft. As the daylight began to fade, candles were lit in the workshop, a luxury used only when necessary, as they were expensive. Work continued by this dim light until the evening bells rang from the nearby church. At last, tools were put away, the workshop swept one final time, and the day's work came to an end. Upstairs, Mistress Cooper had prepared the evening meal, more substantial than breakfast, but still simple fare. Salted fish, peas pottage, bread, cheese, and always more small beer. Apprentices ate quickly, too tired for much conversation. Their days typically ran from dawn until 8 or 9 at night, with few breaks and constant physical labour. Yet Thomas didn't consider his life particularly harsh. This was normal for Tudor apprentices. The security of food, shelter, and learning a valuable trade outweighed the long hours and strict discipline. After supper came a rare period of relative leisure. In some households, the master might read from the Bible or a book of sermons. Master Cooper, who couldn't read himself, instead used this time to further instruct his apprentices in the finer points of their craft, or to tell stories of London's past and the history of their trade. The Coopers Guild was granted its charter by Henry VII himself, he told them for perhaps the 100th time, but Thomas never tired of hearing it. "Our craft is older than the crown itself. Without barrels, trade stops. Without trade, England starves. Never forget the importance of what you're learning." Thomas nodded seriously. Unlike Agnes, whose education prepared her for a life much like her mother's, his apprenticeship was offering him a chance at something different, to be a skilled craftsman, a freeman of London, perhaps eventually a master with his own shop and apprentices. Before bed, they all knelt for evening prayers, led by Mistress Cooper. Religion structured Tudor lives regardless of social class, though with variations in practice. Here in London, just 20 years after the events in this story, religious practices would be dramatically transformed by Henry VIII's break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England. Finally, as the city's night watchmen began their rounds calling the hours, Thomas and the other apprentices returned to their pallets. His muscles ached from the day's labour, and splinters peppered his hands despite years of developing calluses. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, an endless cycle of work, learning, and slow progress toward mastery. Yet, as he drifted towards sleep, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that neither Edward in his manor house nor Agnes on her farm might fully understand. In Tudor England, where most people lived and died in the same social position they were born into, apprenticeship offered one of the few paths to advancement. If he completed his term and became a freeman of the Coopers Guild, Thomas could rise to a level of prosperity and respect his farmer parents could never have achieved. London's sounds drifted through the shuttered windows, distant shouts, a snatch of drunken singing from a nearby tavern, the call of the night watch announcing 10 o'clock and all's well. Unlike the countryside where darkness brought near silence, the city never truly slept. Thomas's thoughts wandered to tomorrow's visit to the timber merchant. He'd been learning to judge the quality of wood, how to spot seasoned oak with a straight grain, perfect for barrel staves. Each such skill brought him closer to independence. In the darkness, Peter whimpered in his sleep. Still homesick after 6 months away from his family in Sussex, Thomas remembered his own first year, crying silently into his pallet at night, missing his mother's voice and his father's farm. But that homesickness had faded as London became familiar and coopering became not just a trade, but a source of pride. The guild system that governed Tudor crafts was both restrictive and protective. It controlled who could practice a trade and maintained standards through the long apprenticeship process, but it also provided security. A skilled cooper would never starve, would always find work in a society where virtually everything was stored and transported in wooden barrels. This structured path to adulthood was common for many Tudor boys from modest backgrounds. Girls occasionally entered apprenticeships too, though usually in feminine trades like seamstressing or millinery. Most, like Agnes, were prepared instead for marriage and household management. Thomas yawned, his eyes growing heavy. Above him, the Cooper's family slept in their proper beds with feather mattresses and linen sheets. Someday, he thought sleepily, he'd have a real bed too, and a shop of his own with apprentices sleeping on the floor. Someday, if he worked hard and learned well. London's many church bells tolled the hour across the city as Thomas finally surrendered to sleep, dreaming of perfect barrels and the freedom that mastery would bring. It was May Day in the village of Wickham, and for once the children weren't working. The morning sun bathed the village green in golden light as children from all walks of life gathered for one of the few holidays they truly got to enjoy. 10-year-old Eleanor, daughter of the village blacksmith, raced across the dewy grass, her normally braided hair flying loose behind her. Today was special. Today work could wait. "Come on, Sarah," she called to her younger sister. "They're raising the maypole." Indeed, at the centre of the green, men were erecting a tall pole decorated with spring flowers and long ribbons. Children gathered around in excited clusters, waiting for their chance to dance around it, weaving the colourful ribbons into patterns as they circled. Tudor children worked hard. God knows we've seen that with Edward, Agnes and Thomas, but they played hard too. Games and pastimes weren't just for fun. They were essential parts of Tudor life, building physical strength, teaching social skills and providing rare moments of joy in what could be a harsh existence. Eleanor and Sarah reached the edge of the green just as the maypole was secured upright. A cheer went up from the gathered villagers. May Day was one of the most beloved festivals in the Tudor calendar, a celebration of spring that had survived from pagan times, albeit with some Christian modifications. "Children first," called the May Lord, a local farmer's son who had been crowned with flowers for the day's festivities. "Take your ribbons." Eleanor grabbed a bright red ribbon while Sarah took a blue one. Other children, some barefoot labourers' children, some better dressed like the miller's sons, took their positions around the pole. The village musician struck up a tune on his pipe and the dance began. "Step in, step out, skip under, skip over," Eleanor whispered to her sister as they moved in the ancient pattern, ducking under some children's ribbons while others passed beneath theirs. Gradually, the ribbons formed a colourful weave around the pole. This maypole dance was more than just play. It was one of the few activities that brought together children from different social classes. The baker's son danced alongside the poorest cottager's daughter. For this one day, the rigid social divisions of Tudor society relaxed just a little. Once the maypole was properly decorated, other games began across the green. A group of boys played a rough version of football using a ball made from a pig's bladder, inflated and dried. Unlike modern football with its rules and boundaries, Tudor football was a chaotic free-for-all, with dozens of players, few rules and goals that might be a quarter-mile apart. "Look at them," said Sarah, watching the shouting, pushing mass of boys. "Mother says 3 boys broke arms at last year's game." Eleanor nodded. Tudor games, especially boys' games, were often dangerous by our standards. They were designed partly as training for the harsh realities of adult life and warfare. Boys were encouraged to engage in physical, sometimes violent play to build strength and courage. Near the edge of the green, younger children played blind man's buff. A boy with a cloth tied over his eyes stumbled around, trying to catch the others who darted around him, calling out taunts and then dancing away before he could grab them. "Want to play 9 men's Morris?" asked Eleanor's friend Joan, approaching with a stick to draw the game board in the dirt. 9 Men's Morris was a strategy game played by people of all ages and classes in Tudor England. Even King Henry VIII was known to enjoy it. The game involved placing and moving counters on a board with the goal of forming mills, rows of 3 pieces, and capturing your opponent's pieces. Eleanor nodded eagerly. They scratched the distinctive grid pattern in a patch of bare earth and collected small stones to use as gaming pieces. Soon they were deep in concentration, plotting moves and counter-moves. Across the green, different games suited different ages. Toddlers played with